Good evening, everybody. My name is Todd Scholl. I serve as the lead learner of the South Carolina Education Association's Center for Educator Wellness and Learning. We call ourselves COOL. You can see our logo here in the corner there. And you can visit us online at cool.us. That's CEWL.us. And on that website, we have a host of resources for educators. And our mission at COOL is to improve the inner and outer lives of educators. And we do that here in the state of South Carolina proudly. And we're thankful to be working with folks and supported by folks from NEA and the SCEA. So I hope you're all doing well tonight. This is another in a series of live streams that we do. And the goal of these live streams really is to facilitate conversations around a variety of topics to help equip educators with the tools and information they need to be successful in the classroom and successful as advocates, and also to tap into their own wellness. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on something called bilingualism. And I know many teachers are finding themselves teaching bilingual students, and that population is growing. And it's really important that we arm ourselves and equip ourselves with the information we need, the skills we need to help those students become the best that they can be and to reach their fullest potential. And sometimes I fear sometimes we unintentionally do things that could potentially keep them from reaching the greatest potential. So tonight, I thought I would bring on one of the country's experts on this. He happens to be my son, but he is a PhD student at the University of Texas, El Paso, and he's been studying bilingualism and cognition. That is what he's working on out there in UTEP, and thought he and I have had some really great conversations around this. And I thought, wow, this would be a really good opportunity to bring him in and his expertise to talk with our teachers about bilingualism. So without further ado, here is Colin Scholl from El Paso, Texas. How are you doing tonight, Colin?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. So do you want to share anything with listeners about your bio? I didn't know how much you wanted me to share, but feel free to tell folks a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. Well, if you can't tell by the last name or the resemblance, maybe I'm his son, and I'm very excited to share with you all, some considerations about bilingual students and how they have been perceived differently historically, and how that kind of feeds into how they're categorized and treated in today. And I think we're in for a really interesting talk here.
Great. So let's start off with the question: why did you choose bilingualism and cognition as a focus of your studies?
Yeah, great question. It's very understudied, as I'll kind of go into in the shortly. A majority of the studies, especially psychological studies, sorry, on bilingualism, didn't really start until the '90s. So it's very recent field, and it's burgeoning, right? As you mentioned, bilingual population is growing very very fast, and it's important that we understand the cognition and how these students think, so that we can better serve them.
Yes. And why did you choose UTEP to do those studies?
Yeah, I get this question a lot. El Paso is a very unique community. It's located along the border, and Spanish English bilinguals are a dime a dozen, and it's very unlike other places I've been before. I love living here and getting to explore different culture. Growing up in South Carolina, it was very homogeneous, I guess. And so it was really interesting. I've been here for a couple months now, getting to interact with the community and with the people here. I've learned a lot, not only about bilingualism, but about Mexican culture and food and all of that. It's been wonderful.
And let's give a shout out to Scholars Academy and Coastal Carolina University for facilitating your trajectory here. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Just give them a shout out.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so I was very privileged to be accepted into the Scholars Academy, which is a program high school in Horry County. And through the Scholars Academy, I was able to take college classes to meet my high school requirements, and was the first student to ever graduate with my college degree before my high school diploma. So I definitely was very fortunate to have access to not only Coastal Carolina University, the faculty and staff there, but Scholars Academy as well. And they all helped me along my journey and really were the wind beneath my sail.
Yeah, definitely want to give a shout out to Mr. McQueen and the entire staff at Scholars Academy, and
Absolutely.
really everybody at Coastal who really saw what you wanted to do, the vision that you had, and helped you reach those goals that you had for yourself. Thanks to them. Let's dive right into your, if it's okay, into your presentation. I know you have some slides you want to show, so we'll bring those up, and yeah, feel free to go ahead and jump right into it.
Great. Yeah, so I think from this quote alone, you can kind of see what the longstanding, perception of bilingualism was. Back in 1929, it says, "Bilingualism in young children is a hardship and devoid of apparent advantage." So for a very long time, really not until 1960s, did we see a turn in the perceptions of bilinguals. And in fact, bilingualism was seen as a deficit. And this persisted because a lot of the intelligence measures and tests that they were administering to bilinguals were insensitive to the fact that there's a really stark contrast between the vocabulary that we use every day and the vocabulary that we use in academic settings. And usually these intelligence tests are measuring the vocabulary that we use in academic settings. Well, we don't get that at home. So if you have a bilingual student who uses their native language at home and English in schools, the tests aren't really, giving a good measure of their capabilities, right? Because they just don't have that academic vocabulary built yet because they kind of had a late start, so to speak. And this is apparent, in SATs. There's been numerous studies on how there's gaps in performance across, different ethnic groups and especially language minorities. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. And so it wasn't really until, like I said, the 1960s that we see with a seminal study by Peel and Lambert. This was conducted in Montreal, Canada, and they looked at 10-year-old students who spoke Quebecois French and English and saw that these bilingual students were outperforming their monolingual counterparts in both verbal and nonverbal intelligence tests. So it really encouraged researchers to question the validity of their tests and how they were considering bilingual students. And eventually this fed forward into a case, Law v. Nichols. In 1974, you can see some of the students pictured below, but it was 1,800 Chinese students who essentially had a huge language barrier in being able to access the education that they were entitled to by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And eventually this led to the Equal Educational Opportunities Act, which secures essentially, the extra considerations for bilinguals and making sure that they have equal access to, good quality education, just like their monolingual counterparts were. Sorry about the dogs. Great. So
They're speaking their own language.
they sure are. Yep. And the research that came out of that, continued to prove that there are certain advantages to being bilingual. For instance, there's greater cognitive reserve, which is essentially, your cognitive capacity. And as you age, that cognitive reserve declines. But bilinguals, because they're having to essentially do mental gymnastics when they're using, two different languages, they have a larger cognitive reserve. And this helps to prevent and delay the onset of dementia and Alzheimer's. But there's also been, numerous studies that look at attentional control and inhibitory control. So this is, how do we pay attention to specific things over another? And if you think about it, it makes sense. Bilinguals are constantly inhibiting one language over the other. So of course, it makes sense that they're better at attending to and paying attention to certain stimuli, right? It's a skill that they've, essentially mastered, wielding two different languages. And you can go to the next slide. Yep. So language minority students, as we mentioned a couple times now, are on the rise. And they're particularly vulnerable in rural communities that might not have the resources to properly deal with them, so to speak. And one report by Hanover Research found that bilinguals are underrepresented in special education in kindergarten and grade 1, but by third grade they're overrepresented. So there's a kind of critical period, so to speak, where these bilingual students are being over-recognized, right, for learning deficits. And we'll get into this a little bit later on. And for the non-native English speakers as well, like I mentioned, there's a big juxtaposition between the language that we use at home and the academic setting. And so students that have high social proficiency, that is, they can, have everyday conversations, in most social interactions, they don't have trouble communicating. Maybe even they communicate for their parents, that they're very proficient, but maybe in school they just don't have that academic vocabulary built yet, and they're particularly susceptible, right, to being over-identified because even though they're perfectly capable of speaking English, they might not have the proficiency required by the diagnostic test for learning disabilities. And this has major, repercussions in terms of, for instance, degree attainment. So you can see slightly the graph here. On the right, the two bars are white men and women versus the left two bars are Latino men and women. And you can see it's there's almost like half as many Latinos are actually completing college degrees as white individuals. And this is particularly alarming in the face of COVID-19, where these rates, this gap increased. So it's really important to consider the impact of literacy and how falsely categorizing some of these bilingual students into learning disability and special education can affect them later on. I believe that there is a report where almost more than half of Latinos are bilingual, right? So we're dealing with a very large population, and that's just Spanish English bilinguals. And you can go to the next slide. What's also important to consider is what's at the root of these issues. And so undoubtedly socioeconomic status, that's SES, plays a big part in it. Many minorities, language minorities, they also come from low socioeconomic status. Maybe their parents don't speak English, so they have limited economic opportunities. So that's definitely a major cause that factors in. But there's also a cultural insensitivity that's been built into a lot of these intelligence tests and these measures, these screeners for learning disabilities. And it's important to recognize those. Like I mentioned, like the SAT, the vocabulary section, historically, some people have found that they cater to more, I guess, sophisticated or high class vocabulary, right? That's not going to be used by everyday, maybe in low socioeconomic status, which I said is very correlated with linguistic minority status as well. So it's really important to maintain a cultural sensitivity in these tests that we're using to measure someone's intelligence, which should be irrespective of language to begin with. And so I wanted to hone in specifically on a couple research studies. So the first one looked at English screeners and Spanish screeners for grades 1 and 2. Like I said, that kind of critical period between being underrepresented and overrepresented. And what they found is that the English screeners were only predictive of English reading ability, whereas the Spanish screeners could predict both Spanish and English ability. So why not test in their native language if they can perform better, right? That's just one instance. Another study looked at school psychologists. They had them complete a survey and ask, what are some of the things that you're considering whenever you're administering this, diagnostic test to bilingual students. And not mentioned almost at all was the actual language differences, right? So if our school psychologists, which are undoubtedly overworked and, have a whole bunch of students to look after in the first place, they're not even considering that, the discrepancy on this diagnostic test might be due to a language barrier. How are they expected to treat these students the way that they should be treated, right? And to be given a fair chance at, being placed into the right program.
Right.
And this kind of all convalesces into this idea that bilinguals are not simply two monolinguals in one, right? We can't use diagnostic tests that have been normed. That is like the metric that they use to compare bilingual students is to English monolingual students, right? And it's not fair because bilinguals aren't just two monolinguals. They're not just Spanish and English, right? There's an interactive dynamic going on between their two languages. That's really important to consider whenever we're screening them for learning disabilities. And this is all kind of reinforced with societal perceptions as well, especially, with parents. Some people still perceive bilingualism as a deficit. So parents will purposefully avoid teaching their children their native language because they don't want to confuse them, or they might not self-select into speaking another language because they're worried that their students will be at greater risk for being diagnosed with a learning disability. So it's really important to change the stigma, so to speak, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. And really, it's important to, again, think about how bilinguals aren't two monolinguals in one. Bilingualism is complex, and it's a lived experience. Bilingual students are using one language at home or maybe with their grandparents. They're using a different language at school. For trilingual students, maybe they're using it, in other settings as well. So it's really important. And that's not even to mention, hearing impaired students, right, that are using ASL and in English, right? There's bilingualism comes in vastly different formats. So you can't just categorize them all into one box, into one label. And there's also individual and community differences in how they treat their bilingualism. Some are very proud that they speak two languages, whereas, like I said, if the parent is timid about teaching their child a language, it's often reflected in their perception of the language as well. That oh, I don't want to be bilingual. I don't want to not be able to speak English as well. It's a common stereotype. And there's also community differences, right? So here in El Paso, it's very common to be a bilingual. It's revered, right? Whereas in other more homogenous communities, it's probably going to be like you're sticking out like a sore thumb. And this all feeds into culturally and linguistically sensitive practices. So I have pictured on the bottom right a bilingual text, and it's the common children's picture book Goodnight Moon, but you can see it has subtitles in Spanish as well. So there's different strategies that teachers can implement in the classroom to foster bilingualism and to make these students feel more comfortable. And one of them can be reading bilingual text. And these are helping students, pair the vocabulary across languages, and it's also encouraging monolingual students to explore, different languages as well. It's kind of a win-win all around. And the biggest thing is just to reverse the stigma. Like I said, there's been a historical trend of bilingualism seen as a deficit. But clearly, according to other research, there are inherent advantages to being a bilingual. And pretty much lastly, to sum that all up, I want to say bilingualism is not a deficit. It's just a unique perspective. And I think that that's what teachers can keep in mind whenever they're dealing with these students.
What are some of the benefits of being bilingual that can be applied to other aspects? For example, one thing I'm wondering about is it easier to learn music if you're bilingual, or what are some of the advantages?
Yeah, great. So there's a lot of skills that are built into being a bilingual. Like I said, it's almost like doing mental gymnastics. And so, yeah, undoubtedly, like learning an instrument, right? You have to have dedication. You have to have patience. You have to be able to focus. And those are things that, because bilinguals had to, dedicate themselves to learning another language, they had to practice using it all the time. Or still have to practice using it all the time, because it's kind of a use it. If you don't use it, you lose it type scenario. That those skills and those outlooks transfer over to different skills as well, for sure. And I think that being bilingual in general, like the biggest advantage is having access to essentially twice as many people, right? So you can have access to greater movies and books, and if you go to school in a different language, right? If you study abroad and things like that. So bilinguals, definitely have an advantage when it comes to that. And that's one of the research projects I'm looking at now. I just collected survey data on how students use both of their languages to study, right? So bilinguals have access to YouTube videos maybe that are in one language over the other. And texts that are in one language over the other, right? They have a greater number of resources at their disposal. Just one instance of the advantage.
Seems like it creates sort of a type of mental flexibility that would allow you to understand. So when I learned music, I'm having to decode something and it's not words, it's sounds, but I'm having to decode from a page what does this note mean? What does it mean? Like when it's
Right.
an eighth note, a half note, what does this pause mean? What does it mean when it says 3/4 time, or like, there's there's all these sort of symbols on the page that I'm having to decode and then encode that into the notes that I'm playing on my instrument. And it would seem to me that if I'm s- if I start at an early age of having to decode and encode a different language other than the one that I'm natively have grown up, just kind of knowing by nature, that gives me the flexibility then to go and apply that to other things, other times when I need to decode and encode.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like using music as an example, but I don't think it quite adequately captures, how intensive, speaking two languages is.
Right.
With music, obviously you have the sheet music in front of you, you can reference, but being a bilingual, you have to have it all up here. So there's a, similar set of skills, but not quite the
Yes.
same. But yeah, there's a lot of overlap there, and that ties more into the aspect of the unique cognition for bilinguals, right? And definitely, how the two languages interact is going to be different, especially for bilinguals that read across two different scripts, right? So people that read in
Mhm.
English and then in Chinese, they're having to use completely different skills to decode and then encode in their understanding what they're reading, and that's why reading is a especially fascinating topic for me.
I'm curious about the how you mentioned that there are stereotypes that probably play into um, bilingual students too often being labeled for special education. I'm wondering if there are differences between Spanish speaking students and those who speak Mandarin or Hindi and are coming over here bilingual from other cultures. Is the research this, is it pretty similar, or has that not been studied, or how would
Yeah, no.
the different type of languages
Mhm.
impact that?
Sure, yeah. So like I said, you can't really categorize all bilinguals into one box.
Right, right.
That's unfair. So Spanish English bilinguals, I believe, are the most represented throughout the country, and I think second to that might be Mandarin. Yeah, English bilinguals. So there's obviously going to be different considerations there. Spanish and English are a lot closer than Mandarin and English, and I can say that from experience. So there's considerations there in terms of uh, when you're teaching phonics and basic skills at a kindergarten level, that there's going to be, like I said, kind of a late start for these bilinguals because they're having to overcome now what they've already learned in their first language. And that might be greater or lesser depending on the language, sure. But I think it's important too to, again, give all of these students an equal opportunity to prove what they know, and that it shouldn't be compared to monolingual students at all.
Mhm. A lot of other countries start their students much earlier than we do here in the United
Mhm.
States with their learning of other languages. I know I haven't experienced this firsthand, but I've heard accounts of people out of Europe that they start this, and many times by the time they graduate have learned more than one other
Mhm.
language. Here we typically start sometime in middle school, and it's typically Spanish, French, or German, and now Mandarin starting to come around. Um, what are the advantages? What would be the advantages in America if we started students earlier with that process of learning another language?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the great ironies of America is that despite its melting pot, that we have this tendency to want to make everything the same instead of celebrating our diversities. And that's very true and evident too in the fact that, a lot of students aren't learning a foreign language until I would say high school. The middle school I went to was the only one in our county that had Spanish offered to students. And so this is, a very unique opportunity that I had and that influenced me later on. And I think in other countries, especially in Europe, it's probably a little bit more commonplace because there's a lot more interaction between these languages than we would see in America. But, as there are more and more, Latino people coming into our country and different minorities, it's important that we have a wide base of speakers that can speak a whole variety of different languages and communicate. And when we can communicate together, we can overcome these differences and overcome these political issues that at their root are, maybe racial or linguistic differences. And I think it's interesting too that there has been some pushes towards dual language, programs, or teaching foreign languages earlier on. But for bilingual students, it's actually putting them at a disadvantage when they have to maybe learn another language besides the two that they already know. Right, so they're having to work even harder.
Right, they're having to learn a third language, which
Hmm.
yeah, I imagine that's very challenging. So, before we sign off, what are some things? What are just a couple of things that classroom teachers can do to be supportive of their bilingual students? What are just a
Sure.
couple of tips?
I think really meeting, and goes for any student, is just meeting them where they're at, not trying to fit them in any one particular category or label. I think that that's a lot of how the education system is engineered, is to try and be a one size fits all. And that's just clearly isn't working. And we've seen time and time again where students are being left behind, especially these bilingual students that might be misplaced into special education, or for instance, my aunt taught remedial English, and a lot of her students were bilingual as well. And so they were getting their English class for, like that students would normally take. They were taking her class, and then they might have ESL as well. So they're getting English 3 times a day when they don't need it. So these students are having to essentially overcompensate, and that's great long term. But is it necessary? Are these students still able to perfectly function just fine? And so I think it's time to just kind of reevaluate how we perceive bilingual students and how we perceive bilingualism, and also consider that it's a strength, not a deficit.
I think that's really the starting point, Colin,
Mhm.
is stop looking at it like this is a deficit and that this is an opportunity, that this is actually, this is a strength for people to be able to speak multiple languages, and that we have to, instead of looking at it like, oh god, I got to take a foreign language, it's
Right.
like embracing the idea of being multilingual, of
Mhm.
that's an exciting thing, and that we welcome this country being having more than one language. I think that's one of the attitudes that's really been frustrating, is, you hear people say, speak English. And it's like,
Right.
what if we all just like embrace this idea of being multilingual and being a multicultural
Right.
country? And instead of saying, no, everybody's got to, like you said, it's that melting pot assimilation kind of mentality, rather than the salad bowl or metaphor, where it's like
Yeah.
we can all of that adds to the tapestry and the vibrance of our country, rather than
Absolutely.
feeling like we've all got to melt in and do the same thing.
Yeah, kind of tied to that idea. I forgot where I saw it, but I saw something where it was like a situation like that, where they're like, "Oh yeah, speak English," and they said, "You and I are alike. We only speak English because that's the only language you know."
Right, right,
And
right.
that spoke volumes to me.
Well, Colin, I'm really proud of you. Thanks so much
Thank
for
you.
this is wonderful. I hopefully folks learned a lot, and if they have questions, how could they reach you?
Sure, I have my email. I don't know the best way to share it, but you're
I'll
more than
share
welcome
it. Is it,
to reach him as
yeah,
well.
yeah. Is it
Uh,
you want to use Colin Andrew Joel?
my UTEP account's probably better. I just typed it in the chat, so maybe
Okay,
we can
I
check
will
that way.
put that in there. So if you want to reach Colin, you can reach him here. And let me see if I can put that up. Yeah. All right. So CA Scholl at minors.utep.edu if you'd like to ask him more questions and follow up on tonight's show. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer your questions
Absolutely.
and work with you as well. All right. Thanks so much,
Sounds good.
Colin. I appreciate it. It's always
Thank you.
good.
Yeah, it's a wonderful opportunity to share my work and to hopefully start the conversation for change.
All right. Love you.
Love you too. Bye.
All right, that's Colin Scholl, everybody. You can reach him at cascholl at minors.utep.edu, and you can learn more about us and watch the full length version of tonight's live stream at cool.us. It'll be probably available sometime later this week, either tomorrow or Thursday. Probably we'll get it edited and posted to the Cool website. And there you can find a whole host of resources, including all the events that we have going on, all the resources we offer. Cool coaching is something that everybody needs to know about. This is one-to-one induction teacher support that we provide. We have 3 veteran educators ready on standby every Tuesday and Thursday night from 6 to 8 o'clock. These induction teachers, which, any teacher in the first 5 years goes to the Cool website. Just go to cool.us/coaching on Tuesday and Thursday nights, and you can access that free coaching. If you're interested in joining us for an educator mindfulness retreat, we're going to be holding one on June 26th through 8th in Old Fort, North Carolina. And you can find information about that at cool.us/retreat. And coming up next, this Thursday, we have a conversation with Dr. Tammy Pulaski from Francis Marion University about the impacts of poverty on education. I think you're going to love that event, and I hope that you'll join us for that one. And I'm really excited about this one as well. On March 12th, Chris Niebauer, I read a book of his recently, was just blown away by it. And he's going to be speaking about educational neuropsychology. And if the live stream is anything like the book, it's just one fascinating thing after another. So I hope that you'll consider joining us for that as well. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. I just want to send a message out to all educators. We love you at Cool. We love you at the SCEA. And if you're interested in joining our movement at the SCEA, just look at the bottom of your screen. You can go to jointhescea.org, or you can text the word join to 48744. We would love to have you as part of our movement to create the kind of schools that all educators deserve, that all of their students deserve. And we can do that if we come together and act collectively. And we want to do everything we can to support you. And we're so proud to be an affiliate of the National Education Association, who is helping to fund the work that we do at our Center for Educator Wellness and Learning. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks again to my guest, Colin Scholl. And we will see you on Thursday night at 7 o'clock with Dr. Tammy Pulaski.